Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this week's edition of Brownsville Matters. I'm your host, Dr. W.F. Strong, and I'm excited today because we have Larry Loft with us. And Larry, as many of you know, is in and of himself a kind of Renaissance man. He has been uniquely involved in the restoration of downtown Brownsville, has renovated probably 20 buildings down there, and is an expert at renovation. And so we're all going to learn together how this is done. So what are you working on now, Larry, downtown?
Well, for the last 3 years, I started just before COVID on another project downtown, another restoration project. Mm-hmm. I started, 6 years ago on the Olvera building, which was right there on between Washington Street and Market Square, right in the middle of the block. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of a homesteading and pioneering, because really downtown had not really started to pop. It started a little bit, but not a lot. It was still kind of rough territory. I finished that one, and I decided that restoring buildings is just like a chemical addiction. It's just like a drug addiction. Once you start doing it, it's such a rewarding thing that you just want to go to the next one. So I finished the Olvera building, at least to the extent that I needed to, and somebody came along and got it. And so I moved 2 blocks down towards the Stillman Museum in the middle of the block. At that time, Washington Street and that block was pretty weak. There were a lot of empty stores, and it was a little bit rough on the outside. And so started working on that building. It was known as the Asheim building. Actually, it was called the Star, which was a store starting in the 1870s and going on into the early 20th century. Anyway, so the Star was one of those buildings. We have a lot of these buildings downtown that are hardly even recognizable, because in the middle of the 20th century, even into the 1970s, they started getting metal facades and plate glass. Oh. And the historic building is still in there, but it's hard to tell how much is there. And so...
Now, do you buy these buildings yourself, or you do it for other people?
In the past, when I was working at the university and so forth, I was just helping other people. I was just helping whoever. And it was just sort of like that last line in our job description that says all other duties is assigned. And so I enjoyed doing it for years, working besides running Rancho del Cielo, working with Voc Tech students and teaching them historic rehab. Anyway, so finally somebody said, well, when are you going to do one on your own besides doing it for everybody else? So I went out, took a leap of faith. I cashed in my whole retirement.
Oh, wow.
And took the loss at cashing it in. But it was banks don't like to lend on historic buildings much. And when you're retired, you don't have the ability to borrow anyway. So I self-financed. So then I did the Olvera building, and then I'm doing, again, the Star, which Stephen Fox describes as kind of a very interesting building that we used to have a lot of downtown, which he calls a single, what did he call it? A single house. In other words, it is a long building that stretches along the property line facing an open courtyard. Mm-hmm. And they used to have a lot of these downtown, and really their style comes from Savannah, Charleston, and New Orleans, which were the trade routes, which all shipping came to Brownsville, went through that route, coming down the coast and then to New Orleans and over to Galveston, Corpus Christi, and then Brownsville. So our influence comes from 2 areas. One is the incredibly beautiful border brick tradition of northern Mexico, then modified by this New Orleans, Charleston, Savannah design. So this type of building was common downtown, But when everything got converted into commercial areas, they tended to get lost because they covered up and roofed over the courtyards and then put false fronts on it. So we knew the building was there. We just didn't know how much of it was there.
And so how much was there?
Most of it was there. Most of it was there. And so all of the residential part in the back was there. Most of the commercial part in the front was there. I had to redo the front and go back to the border brick doors and take out the plate glass. And then that took a lot of work. So then COVID came along.
Oh, no.
And so then I spent the next couple of years kind of, when COVID was at its height, I would drive into downtown, open the front door, lock the door. I'd just work quietly by myself all day in the back. And so it took a lot longer than it should have.
Now, if you're doing a renovation and you run it, like you say, something's missing, how do you find material compatible with the original?
Well, all these years I've been saving my leftover scrap material because if you have, you cannot match 150-year-old lumber by anything that you can buy from a supplier. And so if you want it to look right and you want it to last, you have to be able to use a period lumber for certain things. Certain things you can go ahead and use whatever you can buy at Home Depot or McCoy's or Lowe's or any of the local distributors. But a lot of things you have to have this old material. So I'm lucky. I've been a pack rat, and so I saved my scrap from one building to the next, which lets me then repair a 150-year-old floor with material that looks right and is right, or trim work that has to match and it has to match not only in its color and its tone, but in its saw marks, for example. So the other thing is that when you're working on a historic building like this that is recognized even at a state or national level, you have to repair wood, not replace it. And so, again, you have to have the original material in order to do that.
This is to get the historical certification?
Well, or to maintain it, or to keep it, or to certainly apply for it.
And then you get some sort of tax discount if you do that?
Well, locally there is, if you restore a building and it meets the qualifications for the state or federal level, and you do it under what's called the Secretary of Interior's guidelines, which is sort of the blueprint for working on historic buildings. If you do that, you get state or federal recognition, and then locally you're given a little bit of help on property taxes in order to help maintain it for a certain number of years.
Okay.
But there's a high bar and criteria for sticking to that.
And who makes that judgment? Who comes around and says, okay, this fits?
Well, one is you can apply at the state level for a they call it an RTHL, which is Registered Texas Historic Landmark. Okay, and when you get that, that's sort of like your blue ribbon for your building. It meets the.
So you just take that to the tax office and they say, okay, good.
Well, you go and you apply. You work with a city historic district officer. Mm-hmm. You submit plans in the beginning that are approved with this is what I intend to do. I'm following, this is my evidence that the building was like this. This is what the building looked like. Here are my historic photos. This is what I intend to do with the building. And so it meets local criteria. You get what's called a certificate of appropriateness, in which they have blessed what you plan to do. Now, it's always a problem because no matter how careful you are in the very beginning, anticipating what your project is going to be, it never ends up being that
I'm
way.
sure that's true.
Your well-laid plans usually go in the round file about a week after you start, because you begin to discover that the building was a lot more interesting than you thought. And it has a lot more character than you thought, and a lot more has survived than you thought. And so really one of the critical things in doing a historic rehab is to be around when they are cleaning the building out and doing the initial demolition, because that's when all the evidence shows up about what the building's character really once was. If you send your crew in to, go clean this out and do selective demolition, they will throw away stuff without realizing what it is. And what you're looking for are the shadows of history that are on the walls that tell you, oh, look, there was a window here. We never realized it. Or look at the vents here. There must have been a door here at one time. In other words, the building will generally tell you what to do if you watch and you are observant when you're first starting out. And
what an interesting concept. The building will guide you, right?
the building absolutely will guide you and tell you what to do. But that also means that it will throw you way off track
Of your original plan, right?
of the original plan. And so I always start with a plan. Well, the plan goes out the window, and I know it's going to go out the window. So I submit a plan because people need to know what you're thinking of doing. And then I'll tell Juan Velez or some of the other people at the historic, that are involved in the historic review. I said, but I know the plan is going to go out the window. But I'll call them in and say, okay, look what I found. This is how I'm swerving with this project.
Oh, a lot of people are saying that downtown is finally beginning to show evidence that the Renaissance is working after all these years, that it's really coming to life after, with 30 years of people dreaming and poking at it. And now, do you agree that we're reaching a kind of magic plateau here?
Well, we're ramping up towards that plateau because we don't know where it's going to go. But look at the asset that Brownsville has. We probably have the second highest number of historic buildings in the state of Texas, and we don't often think about that. And there are over 1,000 historic buildings in the historic districts, and that's not including all the buildings like mine that we weren't quite sure there was a historic building in there. So we're seeing a lot of historic buildings that are sort of hidden by the false fronts. And they become an asset for this trajectory that we're on, in which they want to make. It is the one thing that has the potential of keeping a vibrant, active, and very vital downtown. And this is especially true with people that grew up here and love our historic buildings, but it's also true for people who've moved here that are used to maybe being transplanted Californians or New Yorkers that kind of like that downtown ambiente. And so it has a huge potential, but not just for bars and restaurants. We've got to find additional levels of usage that have a wide diversity, because you don't want just a bunch of bars.
Right.
You want neat bars. You want some bars, all kinds of different types. You want restaurants of all kinds of different stripes and character. But you want some additional things that draw people, not just for the nightlife.
Well, we have a bookstore opening. That's
Absolutely.
good.
I went down and I stumbled in there the other day because the owner of that building was showing me what he was doing with that building, because he's opening up, of all things, a bridal shop a couple of storefronts down from the new bookstore. And so it's really neat. Again, that's the kind of thing that we need.
That we need, right. And we need more people to actually live downtown.
We need more people to live downtown. one of the reasons I moved from the Olvera building, which was an incredible, unique building with a central courtyard, again, a one of a kind. One of the reasons I moved to the place that I am now is because it had access from the alley, and I could pull a car or a truck in and park off of the alley. One of the dilemmas for residential is how do you park, and what do you do if some people are a little nervous about downtown. Those of us that have been working downtown for a while now don't have that level, but it's also nice to be able to park off the street.
Sure. Well, in fact, the parking problem is, in general, a kind of blockage, so to speak, to shopping downtown. A lot of people say there's no place to park. I want to go to that bookstore, but where am I going to park?
Well, luckily, you can usually park within a couple of blocks of his location. It's a little farther if you have to try to get to something on Elizabeth Street. But it's kind of interesting. Used to be, when I was growing up here, Elizabeth Street was the street. The post office was there. All of the big stores were there. So it was Elizabeth Street. Well, now it's not so much Elizabeth Street. Now it's Washington and Adams Street that are the oncoming streets. And certainly, if you're looking for a place to park early in the morning, like 8 or 9, there's no problem.
Yeah, no problem.
And sometimes, a lot of times in the middle of the afternoon, there's no problem. Evening, it's a little dicier. Lunch, it's hard because there are a lot of people that want to go to the deli or to the Morning Glory or one of the other venues or the Dodici. I mean, there's a lot of people that want to go to those places. So around mealtime, it's a little tighter.
I think of downtown San Antonio. They have a great number of 4-story garages where you can park quite easily, and it would seem to me that would be useful here if we just had a couple of those. So I know they have one at the bank, but it's kind of located it's south and a little further away.
So if you were,
I call it the bank. It's the old bank. It's the city now.
Oh, this is City Plaza now. It used to be Texas Commerce. I guess.
Yes, right. I think so.
Okay, so if you were in a big city, you wouldn't even think twice about having to walk 3-4 blocks.
That's true.
In Brownsville, we like to park within 3 stores.
That's right.
We don't want to walk.
That's a good point.
So anyway, we're just used to not walking so far. So it's partly also a mindset. But there's no question that parking someday is going to be an issue. If not now.
What do you think about what's happening with El Jardín?
Okay, so that's going to change. Okay, so how historic rehab works is somebody tackles a building in a weak area, and it begins to spin off. Then other people then begin to go, okay, this is not a bad investment area, and they begin to pick up the buildings. For example, when Gorgas Science Foundation bought the Alonzo building and restored it at 6th and St. Charles, all of a sudden that whole really neat little St. Charles area, which had been up and coming for a while, really took off. Okay, that happens over and over again when the key big building of an area or one of the key buildings is restored. It makes a huge difference in how other people then perceive that block and that area and begin to build on it. So if El Jardín if there's a renaissance there starting there, then all of a sudden the other buildings that are on the periphery are going to be of interest.
I saw that one is already being renovated, kind of catty-cornered by the Oyster Bar. That they're putting a new facade on it anyway. I don't know what all they're
on
doing,
that same block?
Yeah.
Yes.
But it looks good. It looks nice what they've done there. Do you have a building in your mind's eye where you say, I'd love to do that one?
Absolutely. I have that building absolutely in sight, and I'm not going to say. Because there are lots of people looking for there's a lot of people looking for entry-level historic buildings, not realizing that it is a lot of work. And so you get a lot of people think, oh, well, how can it could be? I'm going to remodel as opposed to restore. And so restoration
is a different creature
I
altogether.
I have an advantage because I make everything myself. I make my own doors, I make my own windows, I make my own
huge
trim.
advantage.
It makes it more possible than where somebody has to do all of that. I mean, I get a source of bricks, and I can find a lot of the materials. So being able to source and do your own work makes a huge difference. If you have to get it all done by someone else, it gets more difficult.
I love what you did with the Cueto. I saw that building in its original state, with the roof collapsed and water dripping everywhere and needles on the floor. I mean, it was a mess, and you made it a real place of beauty.
Well, I remember that first stage when they first got it and we started working on it. My first duty job was to kind of go in first thing in the morning and pick up the used needles because, I had people coming in to work later or students that were helping on the project. And so I had to pick up the needles and check the place out, make sure that nobody was passed out in the back. And it was a little bit, needed a lot. But that's a really that was an interesting building. I enjoyed working there.
What was the story of the building? It was a kind of a grocery store, bakery? What was it?
Well, like a lot of these border brick buildings, they're a combination of things. For example, it had a sort of a high-end front in which they sold notions and fancy goods and probably maybe canned foods and so forth. And then other storefront towards the side that probably, like at the Alonso building, maybe we're selling tack or something else, something a little bit low end. And then in the Cueto building in the back was a beautiful bakery with huge ovens that was used, and those ovens were still intact, and we preserved them. So you could see this combination of different uses. And also the fun thing on a restoration is to learn about its Evolution and how it's often several buildings that were tied together, or as a family did better and they added on to their business and took a different character.
Did the family live upstairs? Or is
of course, and that is usually the final part, is the family usually lived upstairs. That was true of the Alonso building. It's true of the Star. That was true of Cueto building, true of the Pacheco building, true of on the Olvera building. It was designed as a residence, then it was a hotel for a while. Evidently, it didn't. As a resident, it was a little dicey because Market Square, or the old City Market, which was right across the what's now the plaza from it, was evidently kind of a noisy place because, it would get started early in the morning and people were yelling and calling and so forth, and there were animals and horses and all kinds of things were going on. And so probably from our point of view, it was not noisy. From a 19th century point of view, with having all the windows and doors always open, it was probably kind of noisy.
Quite noisy, yes.
But it started as a residence, then became a hotel, and then became a residence again, divided up into sections.
Do you have a building that is your pride and joy in the sense this is my finest work, or I'm so proud of this
It's sort of evolving as I go along in two things. One is you learn as you go along, and you learn to spot characteristics and spot detail, and it's a sort of a pleasure to be able to bring those subtleties back in a historic building. I really enjoyed the Olvera building and rebuilding its balconies on both sides because it was so distinctive for that area. It was even pictured in the 1892 Twin Cities book. There was a really good picture of the original facade on that building. So I loved that building.
Was that kind of New Orleans influence?
Again, it's border brick in its traditional construction and details and the incredible workmanship of Mexico and northern Mexico in the border brick tradition, but then influenced, just like both Matamoros and Brownsville were both influenced by the trade from New Orleans and then the steamboat traffic up the Rio Grande that tied both Matamoros and Brownsville together, and all of the little ranches and the old porciones and the different history. So I really enjoyed doing the Rab Plantation because that was another building that was very distinctive. And but the buildings that I really love doing are the border brick buildings, and sort of
is the Cueto border brick?
Cueto, Pacheco, Alonso, Olvera.
And with the Cueto, a lot of the brick had fallen in, and you had to build it back with that same brick, right?
Correct. And you always had to find a source because our brick is all made at the various ranchos that were outside of town, and they would be kind of an off-season thing. They would be made and stacked, and then a mesquite fire would fire them all. And the reason we have this beautiful variation in brick is because the brick closest to the fire was fired harder, and it becomes yellowish. The brick that's reddish in color was farther away from the fire, and so that's why you get the variety. It's different, not different clays. It's the different firing. And so when you're restoring one of these old buildings, the red brick is the one that usually erodes most, and you'll see the most damage. Look at any of our old ancient buildings, and you'll see it's the red bricks that are eroding, and you have to go in and do repair. But on Cueto, we had to find a source for matching brick. And so a lot of times you'll find it when you're working on the foundation, you'll find it on unused piers under the building, on sometimes it's just in big stacks outside from some outbuilding that has disappeared, but the brick has survived. So you've got to find the matching brick, and then you've got to match the mortar. I mean, there are a lot of elements that go into doing it, just getting it right. You cannot use a commercial mortar. You have to make a mortar from scratch, and you have to match the mortar's hardness to the original mortar.
Yeah, it's quite complex.
So it's fun, and it's not rocket science once you've been into it. But that's why I kind of wanted to start a program of teaching. I worry a little bit because the old maestros that I worked with for years, in particular the ladrilleros, the brick masons, Danny Montes and some of the others, they've all pretty much disappeared. I'm still working with a couple that are in their 70s and 80s that know how to do it and will listen to me because they'll recognize, because when they started, they were mixing their own mortars. Now, a modern bricklayer usually looks at you when you tell them about the percentage of mortar to sand. They'll look at you like you're crazy and think, but anyway, it's something you have to do.
I remember a story, I don't know if you told me this or someone else told me, but that the arches that are very common in those buildings are kind of hard to construct, and that sometimes that you'll, not necessarily you, but they'll bring in Mexican artisans to do that complex work.
Correct. Because we don't do that very often. Okay, so at Cueto in particular, we had the two huge arches that were done on the interior, and Danny Montes knew how to do it. But what he had to do essentially is made a 12-foot wide arched portal in an existing wall with thousands of pounds of weight above it. And so it's a real finessing job to create a load-bearing arch on an existing loaded wall. And so it was really interesting to watch how he approached it and did it. Of course, when they were building them, they would build these arches on a frame, and be able then to build them and let them cure, so that they, by the time you were building the finishing the first floor and maybe building a second floor on top of them, that you were building on a truly load-bearing wall that could support it. Now, understand that all of these old buildings have no steel. They have no concrete foundations. Their foundations even are really interesting. They step out, each brick layer that goes down. They can go down 4 feet into the ground, and each time you get a brick going down, it steps out a brick. So they can be sometimes 3 and 4 feet wide at the bottom. And so they have this huge foot that gets down to a sandy layer of stability. And so you can have these huge bricks that maybe, huge brick buildings that maybe have 100,000 bricks in them. Because it took 20,000 bricks to repair the building I'm in now, and that was just repair. So you're talking about enormous numbers and quantities of bricks and weight without any steel, without any concrete foundation. And their roofs are traditional border brick, in which the 3x12 or 3x14 or 3x16 sometimes timbers that came all the way from the forest by steamship and came upriver on the steamboats that came from New Orleans. On top of the roof beams is sometimes a foot of brick masonry. That was the way they would traditionally do their roofs. So even the roofs have an enormous load of weight on them. They didn't blow away.
Yeah, they've been through a lot of hurricanes.
They've been through a lot of hurricanes.
Another thing I noticed downtown is that there are a lot of old wells. The people, the 1900s, way back, or late 1800s, they had water wells.
Okay, almost no wells.
No?
Almost no wells. And the reason for that is our water is mostly brackish.
Brackish, right?
And so, but any house, even a modest house on the periphery of the commercial area, had 1, 2, several cisterns that are up to 12 feet deep, and they can be a beautiful dome over the top of them, and they can be 10, 12 feet wide in diameter. And, of course, the only part that you see is what looks like a well coming up out of the ground.
I didn't know that.
And so occasionally there's a well, but because occasionally you can find sweet water here.
Yeah.
But mostly it's our cisterns, because the river water was never considered particularly safe to drink, and it wasn't, because you could get cholera and all kinds of nasty stuff. So every house essentially had its own water system, and it would collect the water off of the roof, and except in a really super dry year, since there were no flush toilets, no washing machines, you used a little bit less water. But Olvera had a 2-story outhouse, if you can believe that.
A 2-story? What in the world?
Yes, it did. Now, that
sounds really dangerous.
Yeah, but they were offset.
I'm sure.
So, but it was interesting to see, because I had never seen one where you had an offset outhouse because they had a hotel.
Sure.
So anyway.
That's funny.
So, but that's why all the old buildings had to have courtyards, because you have to have a courtyard to have an outhouse, because otherwise it's just a little too odoriferous.
Yes, yeah. And was there's a very nice courtyard at Cueto. Was that courtyard there, or did you make it?
Oh no, the Cueto courtyard was there, and there were some outbuildings. There were some outbuildings there that had burned and been lost and destroyed. For example, often the kitchen was a separate building for obvious reasons in the back, and so there was a kitchen there, and then probably some of the families. Families were a lot larger, and relations and grandparents and cousins and so forth, and so there were often large little complex of different size buildings that were used in those historic complexes.
You ever find any treasure? Any coins? Anything?
Usually, you find a couple of little coins. You find you'll find a turn of the century or late 19th century. But I'm still looking for that treasure, and it's worth looking. But I just never get around to it because you never know what's. And so I always, when we're cleaning out a cistern, I'll always see what might have been tossed down there. And of course, the place that everybody always asks me permission to come in when I'm working on a building is they'll ask, where was the outhouse? Can we dig through it? Because lots of neat stuff ended up in the outhouse, old bottles and things that were discarded that we now think are interesting. And the thought of going through the outhouse is kind of like, oh my gosh. But I can guarantee you after 120 years, it's thoroughly biodegraded.
So it's just dust and sand or dirt now?
Right.
Kind of.
So...
Yeah, I hadn't thought that through, but yeah, I can see why. And people go out to the outhouse and just, like you say, throw away bottles and stuff.
But a lot of them, so there's a lot of legends about there was a tunnel leading from this building and leading from that building. And
I've heard that.
Okay, but what I've found is that generally that's where the outhouse was, because what they would do is, you can't move a brick outhouse.
Right.
Like, an old farmer has a wooden outhouse. Well, they just get four people, pick it up, and move it to
somewhere else.
over a new pit. So, but what a lot of them had is they had an entry on the street in which they had kind of like a deck. And so if your outhouse became full, you could have somebody go down on this side shaft that wasn't full and clean it out and reuse it. And so this is more than you want to know about historic buildings. But it's interesting to me because I always want to know how they solved all these problems.
Yeah, well,
So there was an arch then built underground right where the outhouse had been, so you could pass from outside of the building to clean out the outhouse. And so you get all of these arches that are down there. And then you get arches that were built over what was the edge of a cistern to bridge over that. And so you get lots of arches on the below ground, and so you get lots of stories about, there must have been a tunnel going here. And then there probably were some.
Right? Well, I've had people say that there are tunnels going from Brownsville to Matamoros, but I said, I don't think that would have been possible.
You'd have to be 50, 60 feet down, because how are you going to get through underneath the bottom of the river?
That's exactly my thought. Yeah, how you'd need El Chapo to do that one. Well, there was, you remind me, in England, they had these guys that were called tubmen, and they were the ones who would clean out the, in people's basements, essentially, where they would have, their sewer.
Well, they would call it a septic tank.
A septic, yeah.
Which would just be a catch-all for all kinds of unmentionables.
They would come in and load it up on tubs, hence tubmen, and they'd take it out to the fields as fertilizer. But, what a horrible job to have to go in and do that.
Well, clearly that was going on in Brownsville because all of the commercial buildings had these pass-throughs from the street level. And so clearly they were designed that somebody could go in and clean them out.
Well, that would be a good curse to put on somebody in your new life. That you be a tubman.
Yeah.
And what do you think, in having worked on all these projects, and how many buildings have you done? Do you know?
I've done, maybe 20 or 30 now. Because, I'll get dragged in to help with, like, I helped stabilize the little church at Santa Maria, and like we redid the old chapel for the Sisters of Mercy behind Valley. So I get dragged into a lot of these.
What was your first one? The
first one was my grandparents' house in West Brownsville, the Lawrence Hicks house, which was at the corner of West 13th and Lakeside, where I grew up. My family lived there for a little over 100 years.
100 years?
Yep, because the house was built in 1909, and then they bought it in the teens, my grandparents, Dr. Lawrence. And then I was finally the one that sold it, just because it was too big a house for me. Everybody else had left town. I guess sold it almost a little over 100 years later.
And then, but so you don't have any property other than what you have downtown that you're working on now,
So
and the orchard.
I live on a farm, and so I keep thinking I'm going to create a space downtown in one of these buildings, so I don't have to drive for 40 minutes every day, twice a day.
And over on the TSC campus, you did the commander's quarters.
The commander's quarters. I worked on a lot of the old post hospital, some of that. I worked on cavalry. I helped with, what was the jail? They call it the commissary. I guess the commissary. But the one was kind of fun was the 1867 Commandant's House, because it had been converted in the 20s into a big 2-story, 4-square 1920s building. But what was fascinating, of course, it was located right where the arts center, the performing arts building went, so they had to move it. Okay, so they moved it just down the road a little bit, right across from chemistry, what was chemistry. And so what was interesting was that the entire 1867 framing was all still in there from Wainwright's. Wainwright had come in to reconstruct the fort after the Civil War and after the hurricane of October 1867. And so it was really fascinating because I've seen this now in about 4 or 5 old buildings, in particular the frame ones, in which they're built completely in a different form than we use. The
framing is different?
The framing is completely different. The wall studs are mortised and tenoned and fit into the main beam at the bottom. And so often you'll find a Roman numeral carved into both the wall stud and the beam at the bottom, and how it had been made beautifully mortised and tenoned, clearly made somewhere else to be reassembled. I'm thinking a lot of these buildings were ordered from New Orleans or farther up, and then sent down and reassembled here. A lot of them are built here, but in particular the frame buildings. I noticed that on the Laureles Ranch House, which is 1840s, but built by Charles Stillman. So he was then involved with all that trade. The Wainwright, the Commandant's House.
So they were prefab in a way?
Partly. And you can see they'll start that way as a nucleus, and then they'll expand, and then the additions, of course, were done. But I think all of the buildings on Officers Row at the fort had the same sort of design, and I bet you they were all pre-made, because to do that kind of work that you see when you get into them would have required a whole troop of craftsmen and maybe even machinery that was maybe not available here. And of course, they were trying to put up these buildings in a hurry.
Yeah.
And so since all the wood had to come from New Orleans anyway, it had to be all brought anyway on a ship. I think maybe sometimes they prefabbed them. So the wooden buildings are the most endangered here because of, the termites and fire and changes. And so I enjoyed doing the little Lucena house behind Cueto, which was a building that was originally a block down the street, but really, again, an overlooked building from the early 19th century, beginning probably 1840s and 50s, and then expanded in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s.
Do you call that a shotgun house?
Shotgun is where you have a very narrow front, and then you go back in a single house row towards the back. That house was like the Neal House and the Laureles Ranch House, in which they're broad across the front. And so not really a shotgun, although you're generally only 1 room or 2 rooms wide because they wanted the circulation of air.
So then you brought that in over to the courtyard of the Cueto.
I brought it over. I called Dr. Garcia up and I said, would you mind if I just moved this building that's about to be torn down about a block and a half down the street? Now, I'll pay for the move. I'll pay for the move myself. And I'll use mostly scrap left over from work on the Cueto building. I said, it's worth saving because these little frame buildings are the ones that disappeared. The brick buildings, we love them, and they have persisted because they don't decay as much. But it's the little frame buildings that we're worried about losing. Like hopefully Neal House finds a new life. Laureles Ranch House was fun to do. The Lyseca building.
But the Neal House is where?
Neal House is now by the border wall behind on campus.
Oh yes, yeah, that one is.
And it
kind
was
of
early. It clearly has to be the oldest building in Brownsville.
And it is falling apart.
It needs, but you know, they can look like they're falling apart, but because those old wooden buildings were built from the ancient forest of first growth yellow pine of the ancient southern forest, the wood is full of tars and resins, ocote, and they are very resistant. And so they can look really bad. They can even look like they've been chewed on and eaten on the outside, but the center of the beams are still solid. Okay. And so there's a lot of resilience in those buildings that sometimes freaks people out, and they say, oh, it's not worth saving. No, they really are worth saving, and they can be saved.
Well, Larry, I want to thank you so much for coming in and sharing all this wealth of knowledge. To me, you're truly a Renaissance man because you know so much about many, many things. Now, we didn't even get to talk about Rancho del Cielo, and you're president of the Gorgas Foundation and your professorial life. You know, you've been in everything. And I think you're a great asset to Brownsville, especially through your incredible work downtown, renovating and offering us this potential for a restoration of the entire downtown.
Well, it's because it's a pleasure, and one doesn't have a job if one is doing what they really love doing, and it's a lot of fun. I learned how to do a lot of this stuff at Rancho del Cielo, since you mentioned that. I have one more little sidebar that maybe you can cut in, if it's all right.
That's fine. Go right ahead.
Okay. So one of the things that's so important about our buildings is from the street, they're incredibly beautiful. And they're so diverse, and there's so many different types, and we love to see them on the street. But as a person who also majored in history, why they're important is because of their story. Each one has a little different story, and that story is, as Calvin Walker, our local historian, architect, described it, is the historic buildings in downtown Brownsville form a fabric, and each building is like a thread. And we have to save all of those threads. And if you start losing a thread here and a thread there, pretty soon the fabric falls apart. But it's the stories that are interwoven into that fabric. For example, each one will tell you, when I tackle a building, I start putting the story together on each one, and you'll end up with 5, 6, 8 pages of history that really hadn't showed up before. And so it's the history, not just the beautiful external facades, that are so important.
Do you write this down?
Absolutely. I write it down, and I pass it along with the building, and hopefully that people keep it because, I'm trying to think of who is the robber baron? I'm drawing a blank right now that was so involved all the way through from the 1850s through the 1890s.
Here?
Yeah, in Brownsville. Oh, gosh, he was involved in...
I don't know.
He fought for the Confederacy. He fought for Maximilian, and he fought against he was the governor of the state of Tamaulipas. He was considered, I'm drawing a blank.
So that's...
Cortina.
Cortina, absolutely.
Cortina, okay.
So Cortina at the Olvera building on that site, we learned was where the little restaurant and so forth, where Cortina came in and used to come and get his coffee in the morning and read the paper. He saw one of his mother's ranch hands being pistol whipped by a deputy. And so that's where that happened. So to be able to tell that whole story in relation to a site is part of it, the neat thing.
Yeah, it is. Well, I'm glad you're writing it down. And does the historical commission have that?
When you do a building that you intend to have preserved, you have to put together as much of that as you can, because to get registered to Texas Historic Landmark, you have to also put together its story. What was its history? But like when Tony Knopp is doing his walking tours of downtown,
right?
That's what he's doing. He's telling about, okay, what is the story? What is the story behind this building? It wasn't just what it is now.
Right.
Okay, the Masonic Lodge was not the Masonic Lodge 100 and some years ago. It was Cameron County Courthouse. And so, you have to be able to tell those stories because buildings evolve and change, and they're, as the Historic Commission refers to it, they're a product of their evolution.
Well, that's true.
Okay, that's it.
I just
sort of had to add that.
I'm happy to.
You can cut and paste and take out as much as you want.
Well, I think it's all wonderful. We got to include all of it, because what you did right now is an historical record in and of itself. That's why I was just thinking as you were talking about this, that one important thing that we're doing here, Gabriel and I, is we're documenting this knowledge that you uniquely have and others uniquely have.
Well, I had this whole program set up.
Thanks for watching this BSPA video. Go ahead and hit like and subscribe if you like what you see. And if you really like what you see, go ahead and go to our website, brosoperformingarts.org, and smash the donate button. And then we'll really like you too.